Shealeigh Voitl, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Primo.
Yeah, thank you so much for being on today. I really wanted to discuss Project Censored and the recent book that you folks put out discussing the most censored news stories of 2024. But before we get into that, just for folks who may not be familiar about you, could you go through your background and how you kind of got involved in activism?
So I went to school at North Central College in Naperville, Illinois, for journalism, and took a class there with Steve Masick, who's a big contributor to our book series, The State of the Free Press. I took a media criticism class at North Central and got involved with the project there because I did our validated independent news story assignment, which is how we collect our top 25 stories of each year. And I did a VIN, and it really transformed the way that I read the news, consumed the news, um, looked at things differently in terms of the things that I was really interested in reading and how differently they were being covered by the establishment press versus the independent reporters that we were sort of guided to look more into as we were doing the assignment. And then I became his research assistant. And so I wrote for our Deja Vu News chapter, where we look back at past top 25 news stories and see what kind of updates they've received by the corporate media in the years since we included them in our book. And so I've just kind of been involved that way. And I'm now the associate director of Project Censored. So it feels extremely full circle to have been a student involved in the project, learning about the project. And now I speak to students about their media consumption and what they're not seeing and the gaps that they're noticing, not only in print media, but also social media now, too. And so, things are, I think, now evolving at such a accelerated pace now that technology is just constantly evolving. And so we see these patterns now always on our, we're stuck in these sort of echo chambers because of the algorithms. And so now even things that maybe I was kind of plugged into as a student, I'm listening to these really new experiences from students. Now as news consumers. So it's a really wonderful full circle experience, and it's a it's especially fulfilling because I feel like I learn something new every day.
Yeah, for me personally, I think what really shaped my mind about how much the media lies to us was back during the Iraq War, and sort of the first few years after the invasion, before Democrats and the liberal media really turned against the war. There was a lot of cheerleading for the USA and just kind of believing what the Bush administration was saying. And that kind of opened my eyes personally about how we were just being lied to. And eventually, the truth came out. Was there any sort of big news story that really had an impact on you that shaped how you might understand the media, how it lies to us and censors news stories?
I think there have been many over the years while I've been involved in the book. I think there have been so many, environmental stories that we've covered. That seems like a really common theme for us is like always environmental stories. But I would say just recently watching coverage of Gaza has been, even though I've been involved in the project for many years, has been especially radicalizing in terms of like how we discuss the media. And um, it's it's so upsetting to watch people learn about the genocide in Gaza through New York Times, through Washington Post. And so that has been something I think that I've become extremely passionate about, working with my colleagues to discuss those discrepancies. And it's something that my colleague Robin Anderson does especially well in this year's book in her news abuse chapter, where she talks about the strikingly biased coverage, particularly of like LA Times, New York Times, and the language that's being used to mislead readers. And I think the thing that's also really important to remember is that something can be factually accurate and still misleading because of the way that it's framed. And I think that's so subtle and so easy to miss. And so that's something that we're sort of now starting to really discuss with Project Censored. I co-authored with my colleague Andy Lee Roth a guide on what we call frame checking, which is just like discussing those subtle media narratives that are, something we always talk about fact checking, which is really important. It's really important to hold the media accountable when they're blatantly, you know, um, distributing misinformation. But it's also really important to talk about those subtle language choices and caption choices and photos being used, how something is cropped, and how those things can influence us in ways that we're not even fully cognizant of.
You know what's interesting too is kind of considering how I think a big part of it isn't just necessarily censoring news stories, and certainly, they are doing that. But I think another component of it is just the laziness of the corporate media. And you can see that pretty much in any news article about something that you personally know a lot about, whether it's a local news story or just, write up about a band or a TV show that you might be familiar with. There's just a lot of laziness and things that are obfuscated and misstated and just they don't fact check themselves. And they also just don't seem to reach out to primary sources. One story that I broke over the last few years was about Senator Mike Gravel. Um, he actually wasn't even running his own Twitter account. His campaign was, so they were basically tweeting things that he wasn't familiar with. He didn't know what they were saying. And he had, when he dropped out of the race, had co-endorsed both Bernie Sanders and Tulsi Gabbard, and his campaign kind of obfuscated the Tulsi Gabbard part of that. But the corporate media didn't, reach out, didn't think, hey, let's reach out to Mike Gravel to hear what he's saying. Let's just, write up what his Twitter account is saying. So I imagine, that's part of it too, the social media echo chamber and just again the sort of corporate media laziness that has to play a role in how news stories are really not being reported properly as well.
Yeah, no, totally. And I mean, obviously, too, we think about like how news is changing. Local news is dying. They're continuously like understaffed, under-resourced. So that's also a part, that we're thinking of is like, these news deserts. One thing that we, talk about in this year's book actually is this decline. Reporters Without Borders publishes this yearly index on press freedom, and the U.S. Slipped so far down the list. And so, yeah, I mean, that's part of it too, is like these newsrooms are consistently under-resourced. But yeah, the social media part is huge. I mean, I think there are so many things that we are not equipped to look out for in terms of red flags. And it can be so easy to just like mindlessly scroll and scroll and scroll and not realize that you're just like diving further and further into these echo chambers that, were designed specifically for us. So once we start like equipping ourselves with those critical media literacy tools to know how those algorithms work against us, really, in many ways, I think we'll be a lot more empowered as news consumers.
Well, just going with those big themes, looking holistically, sort of at the news stories that were censored, and again, just the sort of the mechanisms of how corporate media operates. How would you overall describe corporate media censorship or media censorship in 2024 and 2025? What is sort of happening? What are they prioritizing? What are they deranking, and what are they just ignoring?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, I mean, we see, every year we see these sort of thematic clusters of stories. And I think one thing that I find, I talk about this a lot, our one of our judges for Project Censored, Robert Hackett, mentioned before that for corporate media, news is about what happened today, not necessarily what happens every day. And I think that's like a um, really important thing to remember when we consider the top 25 stories is that, this list really represents things that happen every day that affect the daily lives of everyday working people, because they are rooted in systemic, inequalities. And so every year we have stories about the environment, which is routinely downplayed by the corporate media. I mean, we even saw that with the LA wildfires. And the corporate media's failure to properly report on the role of climate change in this disaster that was affecting California. And so, that's something we regularly highlight in our top 25 stories, or in our chapter, how independent journalists are sort of making those connections, and highlighting how these systemic issues are affecting people in dire ways. For instance, our number 3 story this year was based on a pair of articles from The Guardian and The Conversation. And it covered saltwater intrusion from the Gulf of Mexico up the Mississippi River, infiltrating freshwater systems of the Delta region and contaminating drinking water and agricultural water supplies, and inland ecosystems, which of course can lead to serious health concerns and long-term damage to infrastructure. And we also, yeah, we saw a lot of stories this year concerning big tech and social media. One story that I found especially interesting was the fifth story on this year's list, which talked about abortion services being censored globally on social platforms. So that includes like Instagram and Facebook and TikTok after Roe v. Wade was overturned in 2022, which sets, this really scary, dangerous precedent. And these women's advocacy groups called, this Dobbs decision the catalyst for the suppression of reproductive health care information online, where platforms we saw were sort of overcorrecting and blocking access to certain information to avoid legal issues and regulation. And so, these clusters that we see every single year are really no coincidence. Like it's usually, corporate media is beholden to, the interests of industries that are often in, direct conflict with what is in the public's best interests. And that's the case in terms of ownership structure and advertiser influence and so on. And so obviously, ideally, journalists' first priority is to serve the public. But sometimes that mission becomes complicated and stories are overlooked and downplayed as a result. And that's why, our job as Project Censored to champion independent media has remained important no matter who's in office. This is like something that um, throughout over the years, it's, we always see these kinds of stories downplayed. And so we're huge champions of independent media and go to great, who always go to great lengths to, provide accurate, reliable information to their readers and listeners and everything in between.
Well, I think one of the big narratives, especially over the last year or two since Elon Musk purchased Twitter, has been that there was a lot of big tech censorship, but certainly there was a lot of news stories got deprioritized. But the narrative now is that, well, with outlets like X or Rumble, there's like these alternative platforms where messages can get out that may have been censored previously. So I guess I'd be kind of curious what your take is on that for folks who say, yeah, the corporate media sucks and they're not covering things, but these social media networks are becoming more free and people can now say things that they weren't allowed to say a couple of years ago.
Yeah, I mean that's a really good question. I mean, it's certainly I think there's a lot of interesting perspectives on this when you think about, I think there are a lot of people that find social media to be very harmful and, riddled with misinformation. And so how can we use it effectively to get our news and all of that stuff. And I think there are, that's certainly a concern. But I think investing that time in those critical media literacy tools makes it a really very empowering device as like, a person who is interested in being a media maker as well. And so I think as long as we're considering those parts of it, I do think that it can be a wonderful tool for young people, especially who, I think it's interesting. I'm a digital native. I've like always, I've always used the internet, and I think that when you are in that position, like many of other Gen Zers, there's like this feeling of like confidence and certainty, like I can intuitively use these platforms and I don't have to really be super afraid, or I know when I'm being lied to, I know when I'm being misled. And I think those things, we take that for granted a little bit. And so it's really, I think, like I said, very, very important to think about those critical media literacy tools when we're using TikTok, when we're using Twitter, because although maybe things have evolved and it's, there's this freedom of expression that exists on these platforms, there's also like so many opportunities to be led in directions that you weren't expecting because of how these algorithms operate. And so, yeah, I think I'm a social media user of it all, but I also find myself really lucky to work with people that invest so much time and effort in developing critical media literacy, comprehensive critical media literacy education.
Mhm. Something I think about too sometimes is, being a, independent media creator on social media. You can see the impact sometimes of what the algorithm does, and how that kind of will feed views to people over certain content that they put out there and keep it away from other content. So I think that influences the narrative a bit. And I also wonder about some independent media outlets. I think that they also get funding from certain sources. We saw that a few years ago with Jeffrey Katzenberg investing into the Young Turks. The Lannan Foundation has also given money to Democracy Now! So I think it's like a sort of a constant effort on the reader's part, and the content consumers part, where they have to sort of look deeper into, again, what is sort of shaping these narratives and think independently. And I think probably a big part of that is looking outside of any given social media network, right? And
Yeah.
trying to get a more holistic view on sort of alternative perspectives on any given story.
Yeah, without a doubt. I mean, yeah, I think I think a lot of people talk about news fatigue these days.
Yeah.
You're just scrolling and you're just like exhausted by the news that you're consuming. And so I think it's really easy to throw your hands up and be like, this is just the way that it is. But it is important to remember that we do also have a responsibility to seek out what, the information that we're not getting from these places maybe that we've relied on in the past, and understand like the ownership structure of different organizations. And yeah, I mean, it's important to not get comfortable as like a passive consumer. I think that's really important to remember, no matter where you get your news from. And it's like it's rarely ever, a reliable situation if you're just relying on one or two sources all the time. So a good practice is that, lateral reading, where you're reading something and you open up a new tab and you're just like kind of investigating further and further and further into it. But yeah, I think it's so easy to just like think like, well, it's never going to get better. This is how it's always been. But we have more power than that. So, yeah.
And I think a big part of it too is, those activists who are going out there and covering things firsthand. Again, when you have sort of people on the ground who are, filming things as they happen, or again, like reaching out to primary sources, like that's something that, again, I just see the corporate media really failing at nowadays. It seems as though it is a lot of them reporting about what somebody said on X, or just, a press release, or these official government statements. Like they're really not doing that sort of investigative journalism anymore.
Yeah, no, totally. And I mean, yeah, we see like yeah, I mean it is unfortunate to see that sort of part of it, we're losing that investigative reporting from a lot of those sources. And I just think in general, just like we've been failed like repeatedly by the corporate media. And I I see maybe people maybe catching on a little bit more now. I think now, especially,
Well, I think
seeing
trust in the media is at like an all-time low, right? It's like
all-time
the media and
low.
Congress are like pretty much single-digit trust, I think, at this point.
Yeah, and it's warranted. It's like it makes sense why people are lacking that trust. And I mean, you see what happened with like Jeff Bezos, like overhauling, the opinion section at the Washington Post after saying, there's I have no interest in, messing with any of the editorial contributions of the newspaper. It's just like these billionaires that are, you know, also just like completely wrecking our media system as well. And so I think, yeah, I think people are starting to catch on and looking for other, information elsewhere. But yeah, it's bleak. It's just like, especially like I said, corporate coverage of Gaza has been shameful in so many ways.
Yeah, I mean, and that's what I find sort of insidious about things like Elon Musk, for example. It's like, well, certain narratives are now permitted where, again, you could talk about maybe COVID differently or, Russia, Ukraine. You can talk about certain subjects, but there's still this sort of hegemony on certain issues like Gaza, right? Like, is the narrative that's the algorithm is feeding people on X, is that really different than you may see in corporate media news outlets?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. I mean, I think yeah, definitely like as a Twitter user for many years, I've seen the app change a lot and just the way that conversations take place and certain things that trend and it's like it's definitely different. Like you said, it there feels like there's this connection as well. It it's this horrible feeling in my gut too to keep using this app that is owned by somebody that I like vehemently, disagree with on a million different things.
Well, and
So
who is like connected to the government now, right? So it's
yeah,
kind of a
exactly.
weird thing where like everybody's using almost like a quasi-government app now, given Elon Musk's relationship with the administration.
Right, exactly. Yeah, it just like overwhelmingly feels like, this horrible and like shark infested waters of billionaires now. Yeah.
Well, let's talk about the Gaza protests a little bit. I think that actually the Gaza protests played a big role in what happened with TikTok, right? Because the narrative around
Yeah.
TikTok is that it was Chinese owned and they're somehow collecting data on people. But I think, what actually happened, and this came out in, various statements from, people in Congress and whatnot, was that people were seeing alternative views on the genocide in Gaza,
Yeah.
and that really put a target on TikTok and other networks like Telegram, for example, because people were getting this alternative perspective that just wasn't welcome in the American media landscape. So, would you agree with that? Do you think that it was really the Gaza protests that put a target on TikTok?
Yes, absolutely. I mean that we kind of saw like Senator Mitt Romney sort of said that like quiet part out loud, saying that, the nationwide ban was overwhelmingly connected to the volume of mentions of Palestinians on TikTok.
Typically, the Israelis are good at PR. What's happened here? The way this is played out on social media has dominated the narrative. The emotion, the impact of images dominates. Some wonder why there was such overwhelming support for us to shut down potentially TikTok or other entities of that nature. If you look at the postings on TikTok and the number of mentions of Palestinians relative to other social media sites, it's overwhelmingly so among TikTok.
So I like found that, this like a egregious threat of censorship and control is like, people that were being activated politically by the content that they saw on TikTok, and that scared our government like crazy.
Do you have any sort of predictions on what's going to happen with TikTok? Because now it seems as though it's in this weird sort of limbo where Trump is sort of, yo-yoing what we're going to do. Similar to with the tariff sort of like, are we
Yeah,
going to do
right.
it or are we not going to do it? So do you have any sort of predictions on what TikTok's future might be?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I find it really hard, I guess, to predict, I guess, about that app in particular, what I found really alarming was how many people sort of fell for this ruse of like taking it away and then applauding Trump for giving it back to us, sort of thing. That was like, I think something that just felt so bizarre, like this idea. Um, that in one breath we were like, oh, Trump is banning TikTok, and then in the other we're like, he saved it, And so this sort of like calculated, weird, uh, control of the app and this administration is like, in many ways, cracking down on free speech across the board. And so like, there's no, I guess I find him unpredictable in that way. But in the same way, I fully have faith that where he will crack down on free speech, you know, any opportunity that he has to do that, he will. So I feel frightened, I guess, just at least in the function of the app and the way that it was assisting people in getting their information politically, especially pro-Palestinian speech. So I feel like that is very much in jeopardy. The chilling of pro-Palestinian speeches like across the board is something that is being escalated now. So I feel very concerned just for activists online across the board, not only on TikTok, but everywhere else.
Yeah, the dynamics of it are interesting because, it seemed like it was sort of a slingshot effect where there was a lot of censorship around things that Donald Trump was saying, right? Around, claims around the 2020 election or, things that supporters might say again about COVID, or the Ukraine war. Like there was a lot of censorship, especially initially around that. So, MAGA sort of got this reputation as being pro free speech, and, they were gonna, again, like Elon Musk was going to liberate social media from this sort of censorship. But you know, I think that now with what's happening with Gaza, especially, that's really undermining any claims that MAGA would have about championing free speech. Because, when it's on behalf of Israel, everything seems to go out the window. And,
Yeah.
we have this defunding of colleges that Trump is pushing currently. We also had him again. It was funny too in that address he recently did before Congress. He was on the one hand saying these things about I brought free speech back to the U.S., but by the way, any Gaza protesters, we're going to deport them and charge any American protesters with crimes. And then he put out a statement, saying something to that similar effect, and no masks and whatnot.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's really crazy because it seems as especially on that one topic, free speech is not tolerated by the Trump administration.
No, not at all. And yeah, I mean, it's particularly frightening. I think, yeah, Trump's crackdown on pro-Palestinian speech in particular is ramping up. And the recent arrest just over the weekend of a Columbia graduate student, Mahmoud Khalil, by ICE, was a really troubling example. Just sort of signaling like this intensified effort not only to suppress campus activism, but also criminalize pro-Palestinian advocacy, like more broadly. And I think another concerning element to that story was Columbia University's inability or unwillingness to confirm whether ICE had a warrant before detaining Khalil. So that, raised a lot of concerns about, institutional complicity. Um, and then, yeah, Columbia's response combined with the administration's move to revoke federal funding, suggests sort of that these institutions may not even be willing to or able to shield students from government overreach. And it's a really chilling and alarming precedent that this sets. If the government can justify deporting student activists and um, defunding institution based on their perceived failure to curb like anti-Semitic speech, which often is just criticism of Israel, then we're looking at a dangerous expansion of like political repression. And that isn't just like one student or one school. This could embolden crackdowns on academic freedom and um, First Amendment rights all over the country.
Do you think there's any chance that, if they really do continue deporting activists and, maybe charging Americans with the crime of expressing their First Amendment rights, do you think there's any chance that you may see some, corporate media coverage and, I guess, the Democratic Party pushing against that? Because, again, on the subject of Israel, we've seen them in such lockstep with that Zionist approach. It's, it kind of on the one hand would be against them, but again, they're so anti-Trump. You figure, this would be a great opportunity for colleges and the media to push back against something like that and the Democratic Party. But again, it's sort of like where they're caught in a hard place where they can't really do that because if they do, then they'll get charged with being anti-Semitic.
Yeah, no, it is. I mean, that's, and I think that is like the goal, of course, is like to scare people enough that it will stifle whatever they expect them to say or criticize. I mean, and I think that's like Trump's whole thing is like, silencing speech that he doesn't agree with. He's made journalists the enemy of the people, and this constant hostility. And that's, I think, where independent media is, how I find incredibly courageous in that way. But it's also, scary to think that these are organizations also in jeopardy for what they choose to report on. Um, I do hope that, the Democrats step up and defend the marginalized against a truly terrifying figure, and all of his, minions, that are working to stifle freedom of speech and many other, horrible things in recent weeks. But I hope, that there'll be some looking out for the rest of us. But I don't know. Maybe I feel hopeful about a lot, but I feel really cynical, I think, about the Democrats in particular. I
Well,
just
yeah, I mean, there's no real precedent for that. Again, just going back to the Iraq War, after a couple of years of intense protests, what happened was that, initially these protests it was just a grassroots movement of people. And then slowly over time, Democratic politicians started showing up at these protests. And then, eventually it led into Barack Obama running against the war in 2008. Also Democrats getting elected in 2006, being against the war largely. But then once Obama was in office, just adopting a lot of those Bush era policies and expanding the drone war, expanding domestic spying, all of that. So, um, yeah, I think long term, there's not necessarily much hope there. But I guess it just speaks to sort of the cognitive dissonance a bit on the liberal side, just because they have an opportunity here to really take the Trump administration to task on this specific issue and have a groundswell of support, especially among younger voters, and activate those younger voters who are drifting, in the last election, drifted more over to the Trump side. But again, I just don't know if they're going to do that on this issue. It seems as though they'd rather, pick their battles and, have it be more about Ukraine or other kind of issues that they're more comfortable with than talking about Israel and Palestine.
Yeah, I mean we saw that, I guess, even, with Kamala's campaign, was just this unwillingness to listen to the concerns of voters, particularly around Gaza. And this like campaign strategy of like, well, I'm not Trump, so and it's like, it's ineffective, it's uninspiring for younger voters who are hoping for a future that, we're we're thinking about climate change, we're thinking about, all of these things that, and LGBTQ rights and immigrant rights, and there are so many things, and women's rights, and so many things that were just like really downplayed. And I just hope maybe that serves as some kind of lesson um, to the Democrats to not underestimate, how plugged in young people are to the issues that matter to them, and to their futures, and to, really listen. But I also think what's really important on the, you know, on the voter side is like that there can't be this sort of engagement in politics only during elections. There's like, it's really not an option to tune out and disengage when an election is over. There has to be, this constant responsibility to pay attention and engage in protests and mutual aid and all of these things that we can do to strengthen our communities, because that's really, I think, where, the power is to get to know those issues in particular, because we've seen electoral politics just, won't save us. So I think there's power in that. There's power in knowing, the ways in which the media is failing us, and how to access reliable, trustworthy information. There's power in that. So there's ways to
How would
stay.
you recommend that people do that? Like,
Yeah.
what are sort of the steps that they can take to, again, try to get the most reliable information and not be sort of duped either by corporate media lies or, again, just things like the algorithm feeding you content that it wants you to hear?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I hate to, be the, just plugging Project Censored, but it really is. There's so many amazing resources on our website, projectcensored.org. Not only a list of a huge comprehensive list of independent media organizations sorted by issues that might, interest you in terms of like labor, environmental issues, healthcare, all kinds of stuff. That list is available on our website. It's also useful for students that are doing the VINS assignment, which is, again, how we got our top 25 stories. We also have a really comprehensive list of educational resources. So we have that guide on frame checking. We also have a lot of accessible infographics about, critical media literacy and how specifically, to use those tools and employ those tools on social media, on Instagram, on Facebook, on TikTok. I know Facebook is sort of falling out a little bit. But yeah, I
Yeah,
mean,
does
we
anybody in Gen Z even use Facebook
I
anymore?
know, well, I don't, but I'm sure there's like some kind of use for it. I think I use Marketplace more than
Yeah.
anything. But yeah, I mean those, and X and Twitter or whatever you want to call it. But yeah, so there's those are great resources. We have dispatches that we publish every other week that sort of talk more specifically about the intersection of media and politics. So we are talking about how things are being covered and the quality of information that we're getting from these corporate media institutions. And so I think that that is a really good place to start if you're really interested in critical media literacy, if you're really interested in accessing independent reporting, but you're not really sure where to start. Maybe you've been reading the New York Times and you're, a little bit frustrated by the quality of reporting. Um, there are really good ways to, expose yourself to those independent reporting and use, the New York Times and Washington Post as sort of this comparative analysis of like, here are the gaps. These are the sources that they used for this story. What does that tell you about what they're trying to convey about this story in particular? I think there's so many things that are so subtle that we miss all the time, because we're kind of taking for granted that, okay, this is the side of the political aisle that I am, agreeing with. So I should read the
Right.
New York
And
Times.
then that's a major part of it too, right?
Yeah,
Is people just blindly believing in something
yeah,
because, oh, that's on the liberal side, that's on the conservative side, so I have to adopt those beliefs without thinking critically about any component of it.
yeah, exactly. And so, and I mean, even as a college student, I felt to that degree a little bit. I mean, I read the New York Times, I read the Washington Post, the LA Times, and I mean, I think there are great reporters at those places. I'm not even saying that all of the reporting at the New York Times and Washington Post are bad, but um, by and large, there are gaps in reporting at those places, and that's intentional. And so just like investigating that further, why that's happening, and where you can get more reliable information without just like having to be like, this is the right side, this is the wrong side. Like there's just so much more, there's so much more nuance. And so, um, yeah, projectcensored.org, great place to start. You can listen to our radio show. We talk about these issues all the time. And so, yeah, that's it's a good place to start.
Awesome. Well, Shealeigh, I really appreciate you being on the show today and discussing this. And of course, everybody should go out there and check out Project Censored. For folks out there who would like to follow and support you, is there a way that they can do that?
Yeah, I am at Shealeigh Daily on X, Twitter, and yeah, you can follow Project Censored on Instagram, on Twitter, on Facebook. We post infographics constantly about critical media literacy tools, and it's at Project Censored.
Awesome. Well, thank you again for your time today, and hopefully I can have you back again on sometime soon.
Thank you so much for having me, Primo. This was great.